Admiral Marcus Kane adjusted his dress uniform one final time before stepping into the grand ballroom of the Pentagon's most prestigious conference center. The annual Defense Intelligence Summit brought together the military's brightest minds, and tonight's reception was where careers were made and broken over champagne and carefully orchestrated conversations. At 52, Marcus had earned his reputation through 2 decades of distinguished service with the Navy SEALs, followed by a meteoric rise through the ranks of naval intelligence. His weathered face bore the subtle scars of operations that would never appear in official records, and his steel-gray eyes missed nothing. Tonight, he was here to network, to assess, and perhaps to identify the next generation of leaders who would shape America's defense strategy. The ballroom buzzed with the controlled energy of Washington's military elite. Generals conversed with defense contractors, intelligence analysts debated with Pentagon officials, and junior officers carefully navigated conversations that could define their futures. Marcus moved through the crowd with practiced ease, his presence commanding respect without demanding attention. He was discussing budget allocations for special operations training with General Patricia Hoffman when he first noticed her. She stood near the far corner of the room, seemingly out of place among the sea of uniforms and expensive suits. She appeared to be in her early 30s, with auburn hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and wearing what looked like an off-the-rack navy dress that probably cost less than most attendees spent on their shoes. What struck Marcus wasn't her modest appearance, but rather how she seemed to be trying to make herself invisible. While everyone else networked aggressively, she stood quietly beside a table displaying intelligence reports from recent Middle Eastern operations, studying them with an intensity that suggested genuine expertise rather than casual interest. "Excuse me for a moment, Patricia," Marcus said, his curiosity piqued. He'd learned long ago that the most valuable intelligence often came from the most unexpected sources, and something about this young woman's focused attention on classified materials intrigued him. As he approached, he could see she was reading a complex analysis of terrorist financing networks in Syria. The document was highly classified, accessible only to those with the highest security clearances. Yet here was this plainly dressed woman, clearly not military brass, studying it as if she understood every nuance. Marcus decided to test his theory about her being out of her depth. In his experience, most civilians who attended these events were either defense contractors trying to secure Lucates or political appointees with more ambition than expertise. A little harmless fun at the expense of someone who clearly didn't belong seemed appropriate. "Fascinating reading?" he asked, stepping up beside her with his most charming smile. "Though I have to say, you look a bit young to be diving into intelligence reports that dense. Are you here with someone? Perhaps an intern or assistant to one of the defense contractors?" The woman looked up from the report, and Marcus was struck by the intelligence in her dark green eyes. There was something there, a depth of knowledge that didn't match his assumptions about her background or purpose at the summit. "Actually, I find the methodology quite interesting," she replied quietly, her voice carrying a slight hint of an accent he couldn't immediately place. "The way they've tracked the financial flows through shell companies in Dubai is particularly clever. Though I think they've missed some connections to the banking networks in Beirut." Marcus blinked, surprised by the specificity of her response. Still, he pressed on with his assumption. "Well, that sounds very impressive. Did you read that in a newspaper article? The Washington Post has been doing some good investigative work lately on international finance." A slight smile played at the corners of her mouth, but she didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned back to the document and pointed to a specific section. "This analysis here suggests they've identified approximately 60% of the funding sources. But, if you look at the pattern of transactions they've highlighted, there are clear gaps that suggest additional pathways through Cyprus and the Cayman Islands." Marcus felt his confidence wavering slightly. Her analysis was remarkably sophisticated, far beyond what he'd expect from a casual observer. But he'd committed to his approach now, and his pride wouldn't let him back down. "That's quite an observation," he said, his tone becoming slightly more condescending. "Have you taken some college courses in international relations? Or maybe you watch a lot of CNN? I have to say, it's refreshing to meet someone so enthusiastic about world affairs, even if the reality of intelligence work is quite a bit more complex than it appears on the surface." The woman's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. Marcus caught a glimpse of what might have been amusement, or perhaps something sharper. Around them, conversations continued, but he noticed that several other attendees had begun glancing in their direction. "You might be right about the complexity," she said carefully. "Intelligence work does require understanding not just the obvious connections, but the subtle patterns that emerge from analyzing massive amounts of data across multiple sources and time periods." Marcus nodded, feeling back in control of the conversation. "Exactly. It takes years of training and experience to develop that kind of analytical capability. The kind of work we do requires understanding not just what's happening, but why it's happening and what it means for national security." "Indeed," she agreed. "And I imagine it must be particularly challenging when you're trying to coordinate between different agencies and international partners, each with their own priorities and limitations." "Absolutely," Marcus continued, warming to his theme. "Most people don't realize how much goes into developing actionable intelligence. It's not just about collecting information, it's about understanding context, assessing reliability, and making recommendations that could affect the lives of thousands of people." He paused, studying her face. Despite her modest appearance and quiet demeanor, she was following his explanation with an attention that suggested genuine understanding rather than polite interest. Still, he was convinced she was simply an intelligent observer trying to appear knowledgeable about matters beyond her experience. "I have to ask," Marcus said, deciding to satisfy his curiosity about her background, "what brings you to an event like this? Are you perhaps a journalist? Or maybe you work for one of the think tanks here in Washington?" The woman was quiet for a moment, and Marcus noticed that their conversation had attracted the attention of several nearby groups. General Hoffman was watching with what appeared to be concern, and Secretary of Defense Robert Chen had turned away from his own conversation to observe their exchange. "I suppose you could say I work in analysis," she replied finally. "I spend most of my time trying to understand complex problems and develop solutions that might help protect people." Marcus nodded, satisfied that he'd been right about her being some kind of policy analyst or junior researcher. "Well, that's admirable work. Though I hope you understand that there's quite a difference between academic analysis and the real-world application of intelligence in operational environments." "Oh, I understand the difference very well," she said, and, for the first time, there was a slight edge to her voice. "I've spent considerable time thinking about the gap between theoretical understanding and practical implementation." Good," Marcus said, now feeling somewhat paternal toward this earnest young woman who was clearly trying to understand a world far more complex than her experience would allow. "If you're interested in this field, I'd suggest starting with some of the basic texts on intelligence analysis. Sherman Kent's work is still relevant, and there are some excellent courses available through Georgetown's Security Studies program." The woman's smile grew slightly wider, and Marcus caught what he was now certain was amusement in her expression. "Thank you for the recommendation. I'll certainly keep that in mind." Marcus was about to continue his informal mentoring session when he noticed that General Hoffman was approaching them, along with Secretary Chan and several other high-ranking officials. Their expressions suggested this wasn't a casual social joining of the conversation. "Admiral Kane," General Hoffman said, her voice carrying a formal tone that immediately put Marcus on alert. "I see you've met Dr. Sarah Mitchell." The name meant nothing to Marcus, but something in General Hoffman's tone suggested it should. He looked back at the young woman, who was now watching him with what he was beginning to recognize as carefully controlled amusement. "Dr. Mitchell," Secretary Chen said, joining the group, "I wanted to thank you personally for your briefing this afternoon on the financial tracking protocols. Your recommendations have already been implemented by 3 agencies, and the results have been remarkable." Marcus felt the first stirrings of unease as he began to realize that his assumptions about this woman might have been significantly off target. "Dr. Mitchell," he repeated slowly, "I don't believe I caught what kind of doctorate that is." "Applied mathematics from MIT," she replied simply. "With a focus on network analysis and computational intelligence. I also have a master's in Middle Eastern studies from Harvard, with particular emphasis on economic systems in conflict zones." The unease was now becoming something closer to embarrassment, but Marcus still didn't fully grasp the extent of his mistake. "That's quite impressive," he said, though his voice lacked the condescending tone he'd been using moments earlier. "Dr. Mitchell," General Hoffman continued, "has been instrumental in developing the analytical frameworks that have revolutionized our understanding of terrorist financing networks. Her work has directly contributed to the disruption of over $2 billion in illicit funding streams over the past 18 months. Marcus felt heat rising in his cheeks, but the worst was yet to come. Secretary Chen, who had been listening to the exchange with growing interest, decided to clarify the situation completely. "Admiral Kane, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Dr. Mitchell's current position. She's the Director of Financial Intelligence Analysis for the Joint Terrorism Task Force. Her team was responsible for the reports you were just discussing, and her recommendations form the basis for approximately 60% of our current counterterrorism financial operations." The silence that followed seemed to stretch endlessly. Marcus looked at the woman he'd been patronizing for the past 15 minutes, seeing her now in an entirely different light. The modest dress, the quiet demeanor, the careful way she'd responded to his condescending questions, all took on new meaning. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, he realized, wasn't some enthusiastic amateur trying to understand complex intelligence work. She was one of the most important analysts in the American intelligence community, someone whose work directly influenced national security policy at the highest levels. Marcus's throat felt dry as he processed the magnitude of his error. Not only had he embarrassed himself professionally, but he'd done so in front of some of the most senior defense officials in the country. The story of Admiral Marcus Kane's spectacular misjudgment would be circulating through Pentagon corridors within hours. "Dr. Mitchell," he managed, his voice barely above a whisper, "I believe I owe you an apology." She studied his face for a moment, and Marcus saw something unexpected in her expression. Not anger or resentment, but a kind of tired resignation that suggested this wasn't the first time her expertise had been dismissed based on her appearance and gender. "Admiral Kane," she said quietly, "I think we all make assumptions sometimes. The question is what we do when we realize those assumptions were wrong." Marcus nodded, knowing that his response in the next few moments would determine not only how this embarrassing incident was remembered, but also how his relationships with his colleagues would be affected going forward. The joke had indeed backfired, but the real test of his character was just beginning. The aftermath of Marcus's humiliation rippled through the reception like a stone thrown into still water. As word spread about Admiral Kane's spectacular misreading of Dr. Sarah Mitchell, conversations throughout the ballroom began to shift toward whispered discussions and meaningful glances in their direction. Marcus excused himself from the group surrounding Dr. Mitchell, claiming he needed to refresh his drink, but, in reality, needing space to process what had just occurred. He made his way to the bar, his mind racing through the implications of his mistake. In the military, reputation was everything, and he'd just damaged his in front of people who would determine his future assignments and opportunities for advancement. Dr. Mitchell, meanwhile, found herself surrounded by colleagues and superiors who had witnessed the exchange. Secretary Chen placed a supportive hand on her shoulder, while General Hoffman's expression suggested she was less than pleased with Admiral Kane's behavior. "Sarah, I want you to know that Admiral Kane's attitude doesn't represent the views of this administration or this department," Secretary Chen said quietly. "Your contributions to our intelligence capabilities have been invaluable, and everyone here who matters knows that." Sarah nodded, though her expression remained carefully neutral. "I appreciate that, Mr. Secretary. Though I have to say, this isn't the first time something like this has happened, and it probably won't be the last." General Hoffman's jaw tightened. "That doesn't make it acceptable. Admiral Kane's behavior was unprofessional, regardless of whether it stemmed from ignorance or prejudice." "Patricia, please," Sarah said softly. "Admiral Kane made an assumption based on limited information. We all do it sometimes. What matters is how people respond when they realize they were wrong." Across the room, Marcus stood at the bar, staring into his untouched whiskey and contemplating the wreckage of what had started as a routine networking event. He'd built his career on his ability to assess situations quickly and accurately, yet he'd completely misread one of the most important people in the room. His reflection was interrupted by the arrival of Captain David Rodriguez, a fellow SEAL who had transitioned into intelligence work 5 years earlier. David's expression was a mixture of sympathy and barely suppressed amusement. "Well, that was something to see," David said, ordering his own drink. "I have to ask, Marcus, what were you thinking?" Marcus shook his head slowly. "I wasn't thinking, that's the problem. I saw a young woman in a simple dress standing alone, and I made assumptions. Stupid, arrogant assumptions. You know who she is, right? Beyond what Chen just said." "Enlighten me," Marcus replied, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear more about his victim's credentials. David leaned against the bar, his voice lowering. "Sarah Mitchell is probably the most brilliant analyst the intelligence community has produced in the last decade. She was recruited straight out of MIT by the CIA when she was 24. By 28, she developed the mathematical models that we use to track terrorist communications networks." "The financial analysis work Chen mentioned?" "That's just her side project." Marcus felt his stomach sink further. "Go on." "She speaks 6 languages fluently, including Arabic and Farsi. She's lived undercover in Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria, gathering intelligence that has prevented at least a dozen major attacks. The woman you were talking down to has more field experience than half the people in this room, and more analytical expertise than the other half." "Jesus," Marcus whispered. "Oh, it gets better," David continued, clearly enjoying his colleague's discomfort. "She's also known for her incredible memory and her ability to hold grudges. The last defense contractor who dismissed her expertise found his company blacklisted from 3 major contracts. She doesn't get angry, she gets even." Marcus drained his whiskey in one gulp, feeling the burn as it went down. "Why is she dressed like that? Why doesn't she play the game like everyone else?" David shrugged. "That's who she is. Sarah Mitchell doesn't care about appearances or politics or playing games. She cares about results. She shows up, does work that saves lives, and goes home. She doesn't need to impress anyone because her work speaks for itself. Except I didn't listen to her work. I listened to my own prejudices." "Now you're getting it." Marcus looked across the room to where Dr. Mitchell was now engaged in what appeared to be a serious conversation with several intelligence officials. Even from a distance, he could see the respect they showed her, the way they leaned in to catch her words, the deference in their body language. "I need to make this right," Marcus said finally. "Good luck with that. But, Marcus, word of advice? Don't approach this like a military operation. Sarah Mitchell doesn't respond to rank or authority or displays of power. She responds to competence and honesty." Marcus nodded, already formulating his approach. He'd spent his career learning from mistakes, adapting strategies, and finding ways to turn defeats into victories. This situation would be no different. He waited until the crowd around Dr. Mitchell had dispersed before making his approach. She was now standing alone again, this time studying a display of emerging intelligence technologies. Her posture suggested she was aware of his approach long before he reached her. "Dr. Mitchell," he said quietly, positioning himself so that they could speak privately without being overheard by nearby groups. She turned to face him, and Marcus was struck again by the intelligence in her eyes. There was wariness there now, but also a kind of patience that suggested she was willing to hear what he had to say. "Admiral Kane," she replied simply. Marcus had rehearsed several approaches on his way across the room, but, looking at her now, he decided to abandon all pretense and speak from the heart. "I want to apologize, not just for my assumptions tonight, but for the disrespect I showed you and your work. I pride myself on being able to read people and situations, but I completely failed tonight. Worse than that, I let my own biases cloud my judgment in a way that was both unprofessional and inexcusable." Sarah studied his face as he spoke, and Marcus had the sense that she was evaluating not just his words, but his sincerity, his character, and perhaps his potential for genuine change. "I appreciate the apology, Admiral," she said finally. "But I'm curious about something. What, specifically, made you assume I didn't belong here tonight?" The question was direct and challenging, and Marcus realized she wasn't going to make this easy for him. She wanted him to confront the assumptions that had led to his behavior, not just apologize for the consequences. "Honestly? You looked young, you were dressed modestly, and you were standing alone instead of networking. In my experience, people who attend these events usually fit a certain profile, and you didn't match it. And that profile would be? Marcus hesitated, realizing that any answer he gave would reveal more about his own biases. Older, more formally dressed, more aggressive in their networking approach. Usually male. Sarah nodded slowly. So you assumed that someone who didn't fit your expectations of what an intelligence professional should look like must be an amateur or an outsider? Yes, Marcus admitted. And I was completely wrong. You were. But, Admiral Kane, you weren't wrong about everything. I am young compared to most people at my level. I do dress modestly because I think my work should speak for itself rather than my appearance. And, I do prefer to observe rather than network aggressively. Marcus wasn't sure where she was going with this, but he sensed that she was building towards something important. The problem isn't that you noticed those things, Sarah continued. The problem is that you assumed they meant I was incompetent or uninformed. You turned observations into judgments without bothering to gather actual information. Marcus nodded, beginning to understand. You're right. I should have asked about your background rather than assuming I already knew it. More than that, you should have listened to what I was saying rather than dismissing it based on who you thought I was. When I made specific points about the financial analysis, you attributed my knowledge to newspaper articles rather than considering that I might actually know what I was talking about. The criticism stung because it was accurate. Marcus had been so committed to his initial assessment that he'd ignored evidence that contradicted it. You're absolutely right, he said. I let my assumptions override my judgment, and I disrespected both you and your expertise in the process. Sarah was quiet for a moment, and Marcus had the sense that she was weighing whether his apology was sufficient or whether there was more she needed to say. Admiral Kane, can I ask you something personal? Of course. In your career as a SEAL, did you ever work with female operatives or analysts? Marcus thought about the question. Yes, several times. Some of the best intelligence support I ever received came from women analysts. And some of the most capable operatives I worked with were women. And how did you treat them? With respect. With professionalism. I judged them on their capabilities and their performance, not on their gender or their appearance. Sarah's expression softened slightly. Then, what happened tonight? What was different? Marcus considered the question seriously. Context, I think. In operational environments, everyone's credentials are clear. Everyone's there for a reason, and the stakes are obvious. Here, in a social setting, I fell back on surface impressions and assumptions. So you're capable of judging people fairly when the situation demands it, but you default to stereotypes when you think the stakes are lower? The observation was uncomfortably accurate. I think that's exactly what happened. And it's no excuse, but it's the truth. Sarah nodded slowly. I appreciate your honesty, Admiral. Both about what you did and about why you did it. Marcus felt a glimmer of hope that perhaps this conversation might end better than it had begun. But he also sensed that Dr. Mitchell wasn't finished with him yet. There's something else I want you to understand, she said. This wasn't just an embarrassing social mistake. Your assumptions about me reflect assumptions that I face constantly in my work. When I walk into meetings, when I present analysis, when I make recommendations that affect national security, I have to overcome the same kind of preconceptions that you displayed tonight. Marcus felt a wave of shame as he realized the broader implications of his behavior. How often does this happen? Often enough that I've learned to expect it. Often enough that I've developed strategies for dealing with it. And often enough that it sometimes affects my ability to do my job effectively. The weight of that statement settled on Marcus like a physical burden. He'd spent his career thinking about threats to national security in terms of foreign adversaries and terrorist organizations. He'd never considered how prejudice and assumptions within the intelligence community itself might compromise their effectiveness. Dr. Mitchell, I don't know how to adequately express how sorry I am. Not just for embarrassing myself tonight, but for contributing to a pattern of behavior that undermines your work and the work of others like you." Sarah studied his face for a long moment, and Marcus saw something shift in her expression. The wariness was still there, but there was also something that might have been the beginning of respect. "Admiral Kane, apologies are meaningful, but what matters more is what you do going forward. The question is whether you'll remember this conversation the next time you meet someone who doesn't fit your expectations." Marcus understood that she was offering him something valuable, a chance to learn from his mistake and become better. But he also understood that she was testing him, evaluating whether his remorse was genuine or merely embarrassment at being caught. "I will remember," he said firmly. "And I hope that if you see me falling back into old patterns, you'll call me out on it." For the first time that evening, Sarah Mitchell smiled genuinely. "Admiral Kane, something tells me that won't be necessary. But I appreciate the invitation." As they stood there, the tension between them began to ease. Marcus realized that his embarrassing mistake might have led to something valuable, insight into his own biases and the beginning of what could become mutual respect with one of the intelligence community's most important figures. But their conversation was far from over, and Marcus sensed that the real test of his character was still to come. The conversation between Marcus and Sarah was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. James Westfield, the Deputy Director of National Intelligence, who approached them with the measured pace of someone bearing important news. "Dr. Mitchell, Admiral Kane," he said, nodding to each of them in turn. "I apologize for interrupting, but, Sarah, there's been a development in the Syrian operation that requires your immediate attention." Sarah's demeanor shifted instantly from social to professional, and Marcus watched with fascination as she transformed before his eyes. The quiet woman who had patiently endured his condescension moments earlier was replaced by a focused intelligence professional whose attention was now completely absorbed by matters of national security. "What kind of development?" she asked, her voice crisp and authoritative. "Intelligence intercepts suggest that the financial network you've been tracking has accelerated their timeline. We're seeing unusual movement patterns in the accounts you identified, and the field team in Damascus is reporting increased activity at locations your analysis flagged as high-priority targets." Marcus found himself listening intently, partly from professional interest but also from a growing appreciation for the real-world impact of Dr. Mitchell's work. This wasn't academic analysis or theoretical modeling. This was intelligence that directly affected operations in the field and the safety of American personnel. "How much acceleration are we talking about?" Sarah asked. "Our best estimate is that whatever they were planning for next month is now happening within the next 72 hours. Sarah's expression grew more serious. "That changes everything. The financial flows I've been tracking were designed to support a sustained operation, not a rushed one. If they're accelerating the timeline, they're either responding to pressure we don't know about, or they've identified a window of opportunity that won't be available later." Marcus was struck by the speed and clarity of her analysis. In the space of 30 seconds, she'd processed new information and identified implications that would inform immediate operational decisions. "There's more," Dr. Westfield continued. "The NSA intercepts suggest they're planning to move the operation to a location we haven't been monitoring. Your financial analysis identified several potential alternate sites, but we need to prioritize our surveillance resources. I'll need to see the intercepts and cross-reference them with the transaction patterns from the last 2 weeks," Sarah said immediately. "If they're moving to an alternate location, the financial flows will have shifted to support the new logistics requirements." Dr. Westfield nodded. "I was hoping you'd say that. How quickly can you have an assessment?" "Give me access to the data and, for hours," she replied without hesitation. "Dr. Mitchell," Marcus interjected, surprising himself by speaking up. "If you don't mind me asking, what kind of operational timeline are we looking at? How urgent is this situation?" Sarah and Dr. Westfield both turned to look at him, and Marcus realized he was inserting himself into a conversation that might not concern him. But his years of operational experience had given him insights into the rhythm of crisis response, and something about this situation felt familiar. "I'm sorry, Admiral Kane," Dr. Westfield said politely. "This operation falls outside your current portfolio." "Of course," Marcus replied, stepping back.
I didn't mean to overstep. But Sarah was studying him with a thoughtful expression. Actually, Dr. Westfield, Admiral Kane's operational experience might be valuable here. The situation we're dealing with has both financial and tactical components. Marcus felt a surge of surprise and gratitude. After his behavior earlier in the evening, he would have expected Dr. Mitchell to exclude him from any professional discussions. Instead, she was advocating for his involvement. What do you mean? Dr. Westfield asked. If the terrorist cell is accelerating their timeline, they're operating under pressure, Sarah explained. That pressure will affect not just their financial arrangements, but their tactical planning as well. Admiral Kane has more experience than anyone here in understanding how operational stress affects decision-making in the field. Marcus understood that she was offering him an opportunity to contribute meaningfully to a situation where his expertise was genuinely valuable. It was both a generous gesture and a test of his ability to move beyond their earlier interaction. If you're comfortable with my involvement, I'd be happy to offer whatever insights I can, he said carefully. Dr. Westfield considered for a moment, then nodded. Very well. Sarah, why don't you brief Admiral Kane on the operational background while I arrange access to the latest intelligence? As Dr. Westfield moved away to make his arrangements, Sarah turned to Marcus with an expression that was purely professional but not unfriendly. Admiral Kane, what I'm about to share with you is classified at the highest levels. Are you cleared for compartmentalized intelligence regarding ongoing Middle Eastern operations? Yes, Marcus replied, his own demeanor shifting to match hers. TSSCI with regional compartments. Sarah nodded and began what Marcus quickly realized was one of the most sophisticated operational briefings he'd ever received. Speaking quietly but clearly, she outlined a complex terrorist financing network that stretched across 6 countries and involved dozens of seemingly legitimate businesses, charitable organizations, and financial institutions. The network we've been tracking controls approximately $40 million in assets, she explained, but, more importantly, it coordinates the movement of personnel and materials across borders in ways that appear completely legal to local authorities. Marcus listened intently, asking occasional questions that revealed his understanding of operational logistics and security procedures. As Sarah provided more details, he began to see patterns that his field experience helped him interpret. The acceleration you're concerned about, he said thoughtfully, it could be driven by several factors. Has there been any change in local security arrangements? New checkpoints, increased patrols, that kind of thing? Actually, yes, Sarah replied, her eyes lighting up with interest. Lebanese security forces increased their border monitoring 2 weeks ago, and Jordan implemented new banking regulations that went into effect Monday. Then, they're not accelerating because of opportunity, Marcus said with growing confidence. They're accelerating because their operational window is closing. The pressure isn't internal, it's external. Sarah's expression showed that she was following his reasoning. Which means they're willing to accept higher risks and reduced operational security to maintain their timeline. Exactly. And that changes how we should be looking at their financial movements. How so? Marcus paused, organizing his thoughts. In my experience, when an operation is rushed due to external pressure, the financial support becomes less efficient but more traceable. They have to use backup funding sources, alternate transfer methods, and emergency protocols that are usually kept in reserve. Sarah was nodding enthusiastically now. So instead of looking for the sophisticated financial flows we've been tracking, we should be looking for the cruder backup systems. Right. The network you've mapped represents their preferred operational methods. But, if they're under pressure, they'll fall back on simpler, more direct funding arrangements that won't show up in your primary analysis. Dr. Westfield returned with a tablet containing the latest intelligence intercepts, and Marcus watched as Sarah absorbed the new information with remarkable speed. Her ability to process complex data and identify relevant patterns was unlike anything he'd seen outside of the most elite analytical units. Admiral Kane, look at this, she said, showing him a series of intercepted communications. Does this tactical chatter match what you'd expect from a rushed operation?
Marcus studied the intercepts, his years of experience in similar situations helping him decode the subtle indicators of stress and urgency in the communications.
"This is definitely rushed," he confirmed. "Look at the communication frequency and the lack of operational security protocols they'd normally follow. They're cutting corners because they don't have time to do things properly. And cutting corners makes them vulnerable," Sarah added. "Exactly. Dr.
Mitchell, if you can identify their backup financial systems, we should be able to predict their next moves with much greater accuracy." Sarah was already working on her tablet, accessing databases and analytical tools that Marcus didn't recognize but clearly understood the significance of. Her fingers moved across the screen with practiced efficiency, calling up financial records and cross-referencing them with the new intelligence. "Here," she said after several minutes of intensive work. "Emergency fund transfers from 3 different sources, all occurring within the last 18 hours. The amounts are smaller than their usual operations, but the timing and destination patterns suggest they're funding immediate tactical requirements." Marcus leaned over to study her analysis, and was struck by both the sophistication of her methodology and the clarity of her conclusions. "Where are the funds being directed?" he asked. "2 locations. Damascus, which we expected, and..." She paused, her expression growing concerned, "Istanbul." Dr. Westfield, who had been monitoring their collaboration with obvious interest, immediately grasped the implications.
"Istanbul wasn't in our operational assessment," he said grimly. "No," Sarah confirmed. "But it makes perfect sense if they're operating under pressure.
Istanbul gives them access to European networks, alternate escape routes, and backup operational support that wouldn't be available from Damascus alone." Marcus felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with operational insights that could affect the safety of personnel in the field. "Dr. Westfield, if they're operating in Istanbul now, the threat profile changes significantly.
We're not just looking at a regional operation anymore, we're looking at something with potential international implications."
"Agreed," Dr. Westfield replied.
"Sarah, how confident are you in this analysis?"
"Given the financial evidence and Admiral Kane's operational assessment, I'd estimate 90% confidence that they've expanded operations to Istanbul within the last 24 hours. Dr. Westfield nodded grimly.
"I need to brief the secretary immediately. Sarah, can you have a full analysis ready within 2 hours instead of 4? If Admiral Kane is willing to continue providing operational context, yes." Marcus didn't hesitate. "Absolutely."
As Dr. Westfield hurried away to brief senior officials, Marcus found himself working alongside the woman he'd patronized just hours earlier, applying his operational experience to support her analytical expertise in a collaboration that was producing insights neither could have developed alone. "Dr. Mitchell," he said during a brief pause in their work, "I want you to know how impressed I am with your capabilities. What we're accomplishing here is remarkable." Sarah looked up from her analysis with an expression that was both appreciative and slightly amused. "Admiral Kane, a few hours ago you thought I was an amateur trying to understand intelligence work by reading newspaper articles.
Now you're impressed by my capabilities. What changed?" Marcus considered the question seriously.
"I stopped making assumptions and started paying attention to what you actually do and how you do it. I wish I'd done that from the beginning."
"So do I," Sarah replied.
"But, I have to say, your operational insights have been invaluable tonight. This analysis would have taken me much longer without your input." Marcus felt a warmth that had nothing to do with professional accomplishment. Despite his earlier behavior, Dr. Sarah Mitchell had not only forgiven his assumptions but had found a way to work with him that benefited both their capabilities and, more importantly, the mission they were supporting. As they returned to their analysis, Marcus realized that his humiliating mistake at the beginning of the evening had led to something he never could have anticipated, a professional partnership built on mutual respect and complementary expertise. But he also understood that their work was just beginning, and the real test of their collaboration lay in the hours ahead. The next 18 hours would prove to be among the most intense and consequential of both Marcus's and Sarah's careers. Working from a secure conference room in the Pentagon's intelligence wing, they had transformed from awkward social acquaintances to an effective analytical team, combining Sarah's mathematical brilliance with Marcus's operational expertise to track a terrorist threat that was evolving in real time. By 3 in the morning, they had identified not only the Istanbul operation but also a coordinated network of cells across 4 countries, all linked by the emergency financial flows that Sarah's analysis had uncovered. Their work had directly informed the deployment of special operations teams and intelligence assets across 2 continents. Marcus sat back in his chair, rubbing his tired eyes as he watched Sarah continue her analysis with an energy that seemed inexhaustible. She had been working for nearly 12 straight hours, pausing only for coffee and brief updates from field teams, yet her focus remained sharp and her insights continued to drive the operation forward. "Dr. Mitchell," he said quietly, "you need to get some rest. You've been at this all night." Sarah looked up from her screen, and, for the first time since the crisis began, Marcus saw fatigue in her expression. But there was also satisfaction, the look of someone who knew their work had made a difference. "The field teams in Istanbul just reported that they've identified the target location," she said. "The financial flows we tracked led them directly to the operational center. They're moving in within the hour." Marcus felt the familiar mix of tension and anticipation that came with operational culminations. "Are you confident in the intelligence?" "As confident as I can be without being there myself," Sarah replied. "The financial evidence is clear, your operational assessment confirmed the tactical indicators, and the field intelligence corroborates both." Dr. Westfield entered the conference room, followed by Secretary Chen and General Hoffman. All 3 looked as tired as Marcus felt, but their expressions suggested they brought good news. "Sarah, Marcus," Secretary Chen said, using their first names in a way that indicated the informal camaraderie that develops during crisis situations, "I wanted to update you personally on the results of your analysis. The Istanbul team has successfully neutralized the immediate threat," Dr. Westfield added. "They recovered significant intelligence about planned operations across Europe, and they've detained 7 individuals who were involved in coordinating the accelerated timeline." Sarah's expression showed relief and professional satisfaction. "And the financial network?" "Being rolled up as we speak," General Hoffman replied. "The European banking authorities are freezing accounts based on your analysis, and 3 other cells have been disrupted based on the operational patterns you identified." Marcus felt a surge of pride in their collaboration, but also a deeper appreciation for the real-world impact of Dr. Mitchell's work. Lives had been saved because of her ability to track financial flows and his ability to interpret operational pressure. "More importantly," Secretary Chen continued, "the methods you developed working together have given us new capabilities for rapid threat assessment. The combination of financial analysis and operational evaluation has proven remarkably effective." Sarah and Marcus exchanged glances, both understanding the implications. Their emergency collaboration had not only addressed the immediate crisis but had also demonstrated the value of integrated analytical approaches. "Sir," Marcus said, "Dr. Mitchell's analytical capabilities are extraordinary. I've never seen anyone process complex information and identify actionable intelligence as quickly or as accurately." "And Admiral Kane's operational insights were crucial to interpreting the intelligence correctly," Sarah added. "Without his understanding of how pressure affects tactical decision-making, we might have missed the significance of the timeline acceleration." Secretary Chen smiled for the first time in hours. "Which brings me to my next point. We're forming a new joint analysis unit that will integrate financial intelligence with operational assessment for rapid threat evaluation. Sarah, I'd like you to head the analytical component." Sarah's expression showed both surprise and interest. "I'd be honored, Mr. Secretary." "And, Marcus," the secretary continued, "I'd like you to head the operational component. Your experience and your ability to work effectively with analytical personnel make you ideal for the position." Marcus felt a moment of disorientation. 12 hours earlier, he'd been embarrassing himself at a social function. Now he was being offered a position that would represent a significant advancement in his career, working directly with the woman he'd initially dismissed. "Sir, I'm deeply honored by the offer," he replied. "But I think Dr. Mitchell should be aware of my behavior earlier this evening before she agrees to work with me on a permanent basis." Sarah looked at him with surprise, and Marcus realized she hadn't expected him to bring up their initial interaction in this professional context.
Admiral Kane, Secretary Chen said with slight amusement, I'm aware of your social missteps last evening.
General Hoffman briefed me on the situation several hours ago. Marcus felt heat rising in his cheeks again, but Secretary Chen continued. What I find interesting is that despite that awkward beginning, you and Dr. Mitchell developed an effective working relationship that produced exceptional results under pressure. That suggests to me that both of you have the maturity and professionalism to move beyond initial misunderstandings.
Sarah spoke up.
Mr. Secretary, Admiral Kane's willingness to acknowledge his mistakes and learn from them was evident throughout our collaboration tonight. I have complete confidence in his professional capabilities and his character.
Marcus looked at her with gratitude and amazement.
After everything that had happened, she was not only willing to work with him but was actively supporting his advancement.
Then, it's settled, Secretary Chen said.
You'll both have 2 weeks to wrap up your current responsibilities before taking on your new positions. As the senior officials left the conference room, Marcus and Sarah found themselves alone for the first time since the crisis had begun. The silence stretched between them, but it was comfortable rather than awkward. Dr. Mitchell, Marcus said finally, I don't know how to thank you for your support tonight, both professionally and personally.
Sarah, she corrected gently. I think after 18 hours of collaboration, we can use first names. Sarah, then. And, please call me Marcus.
She smiled, the first truly relaxed expression he'd seen from her since they'd met. Marcus, what happened between us tonight, both the embarrassing part and the productive part, taught me something important about the value of second chances.
What do you mean?
When you made assumptions about me at the reception, my first instinct was to write you off as another prejudiced officer who couldn't see past his own biases. But you proved that people can change, that they can recognize their mistakes and grow from them. Marcus was quiet for a moment, processing the implications of her statement. And I learned something about the danger of first impressions, both making them and being influenced by them.
The question is, Sarah said thoughtfully, what do we do with those lessons going forward?
Marcus considered the question seriously. In our new positions, we'll be working with people who don't fit conventional profiles, people who might be dismissed or underestimated because they don't match expectations.
Exactly.
We have an opportunity to create an environment where capabilities matter more than appearances or assumptions. An environment where someone like you would be recognized immediately for their expertise rather than having to prove themselves despite their appearance.
Sarah nodded.
And where someone like you would ask questions rather than making assumptions, and would listen to answers rather than dismissing them. Marcus felt the weight of responsibility that came with their new positions, but also excitement about the possibilities. Sarah, I want you to know that working with you tonight has been one of the most professionally rewarding experiences of my career. Your analytical capabilities are remarkable, but your character is even more impressive.
Thank you, Marcus.
And I want you to know that your willingness to acknowledge your mistakes and learn from them tells me everything I need to know about the kind of leader you are. As they gathered their materials and prepared to leave, Marcus reflected on the extraordinary 24 hours that had begun with his humiliating mistake and culminated in a professional partnership that would shape the rest of his career.
Sarah, he said as they waited for the elevator, can I ask you something personal?
Of course.
How many times have you had to deal with the kind of assumptions I made about you?
Sarah was quiet for a moment.
More often than I'd like to admit.
But, Marcus, tonight was different. Most people who make those assumptions never recognize they've made them, let alone apologize for them and learn from them.
That's not acceptable. People like you should be judged on their capabilities, not on whether they fit someone's preconceptions. People like me?
Brilliant analysts whose expertise could save lives but who might be overlooked because they don't look like what someone expects an intelligence professional to look like.
Sarah smiled.
That's exactly the kind of thinking that will make you an excellent leader for our new unit. As the elevator arrived, Marcus realized that his embarrassing joke at the reception had indeed backfired, but not in the way he'd initially thought. Instead of simply damaging his reputation, it had forced him to confront his own biases and had led to a professional relationship that would benefit not only his career but also national security. 6 months later, the Joint Analysis Unit headed by Sarah Mitchell and Marcus Kane had become one of the most successful innovations in the intelligence community. Their integrated approach to financial and operational analysis had prevented dozens of attacks and dismantled terrorist networks that had previously operated below the radar of traditional intelligence methods. More importantly, their unit had become known for its diverse personnel and its culture of merit-based evaluation. Sarah's insistence on judging people by their capabilities rather than their backgrounds, combined with Marcus's operational experience and his hard-won understanding of the dangers of assumptions, had created an environment where the best analysts thrived regardless of their age, gender, or appearance. Marcus often reflected on the evening that had changed both of their careers. His moment of embarrassing prejudice had become a catalyst for personal growth and professional excellence. He'd learned that the most valuable intelligence often comes from unexpected sources, and that the greatest threats to national security sometimes come not from foreign adversaries but from our own limitations and biases. Sarah, meanwhile, had discovered that some people are capable of profound change when confronted with their mistakes. Marcus's willingness to acknowledge his prejudice and learn from it had restored her faith in the possibility of creating a more equitable and effective intelligence community. Their partnership had begun with a backfired joke, but it had evolved into something neither had expected, a professional relationship built on mutual respect, complementary expertise, and a shared commitment to excellence that transcended personal backgrounds and initial impressions. The reception where they'd first met had been designed to bring together the military's brightest minds. In an unexpected way, it had succeeded beyond anyone's imagination, creating not just a professional partnership but a model for how the intelligence community could harness diverse talents and perspectives to meet the challenges of an increasingly complex world. Marcus's assumptions about Sarah had been completely wrong, but his willingness to acknowledge those mistakes and learn from them had proven to be exactly right. And Sarah's decision to give him a second chance had not only advanced her own career but had helped create positive change throughout the intelligence community. Their story became something of a legend within Pentagon circles, a reminder that the greatest intelligence failures often result from our inability to recognize the expertise that exists right in front of us, and that the greatest intelligence successes come from our willingness to set aside assumptions and listen to what people actually have to say.